So I feel like I need to begin this message with doing just a little bit of review. And that's partly because I'm the new guy here. And Pastor Mark has allowed me to kind of jump in the middle of his sermon series and take a section of that. So I did a little bit of homework this week, trying to go back to the very beginning when Pastor Mark started. And let me know if I need to do something with my mic here. When Pastor Mark started in January into Mark, man, that's confusing. Pastor Mark. Anyway, I listened to the first message because I wanted to know kind of where he was going and how he saw the book unfolding, and I didn't want to get off in left field. And I really appreciated the message, but there were several things that stood out to me that I feel are really helpful today in the section that we're going to be looking at. So I want to highlight those at the beginning. So we'll start with a little bit of review, and we'll talk about a little bit of background information that's going on that's contributing to the story we're looking at, and then we'll dive into the text. So just bear with me here. There's a little bit of time here we need to just kind of set things up this morning. So Mark's gospel is a story that began well before the time when Jesus shows up on the scene, right? So at the very beginning of this gospel, Mark is very careful to tell us that this is really about fulfillment. So right away we hear from Mark that Jesus' life is fulfilling predictions that were made hundreds of years before he comes on the scene. And Pastor Mark, in commenting on that, said this in his sermon. Mark, the guy who wrote the book, is telling his audience that everything we have been waiting for has finally come true. Jesus' story fulfills both Isaiah and Malachi's prophecy that God would rescue his people and restore Jerusalem to be a light to the nations. So God is up to restoring his people and restoring them so they can be a light to the nations. Now this person this book is written about is Jesus Christ, and he's a person described in the Old Testament with at least two identities that Mark is trying to pull in here. So Pastor Mark explained to us that the first identity is Messiah, Son of God, and that comes right out of Psalms 2. The second identity that Mark is pulling in is servant of God, and that comes out of Isaiah chapter 42. So at Jesus' baptism, which is, again, Mark chapter 1, we hear the Father's voice say from heaven, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." That's Mark 1, verse 11. And so Pastor Mark commented on that and said this. So in many ways, God's proclamation in verse 11, which is the verse we just read, drives Mark's theme through the entire book. Everyone, including the disciples, are going to struggle to put these two ideas together, that the Messianic Son of God is also the suffering servant who will bear the sins of many and make intercession for the transgressors. The last thing I want us to remember from Mark's sermon is that Jesus' mission as a Messiah, Son of God, and a servant always included the nations beyond Israel's physical borders. So this idea that Christ would come and reach out to Gentiles is not a new thing. This is part of the promises. In fact, where Mark, the author of the book, chooses to go to pull in these themes, we see this explicitly. If we look, for instance, at Psalms 2, which is where he pulls in the idea of Christ being the Son, it says this, 2 verse 7, "I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, 'You are my Son. Today I have begotten you. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession.'" So Jesus didn't come to just claim Israel. He came to claim every ethnicity on the planet. And then we look at Isaiah 42, which is where we get the servant, him being the servant. This is what it says, verse 1. "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to who? The nations. And if you follow it down to verse 6, it says this, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles. So clearly, God is on a mission that includes nations beyond Israel. So that's all I want to talk about from Pastor Mark's sermon. I think that helps us to get ready for today's text. But before we go there, I want to direct your attention to your bulletin. I had Donna help me print these out, and I didn't know what it would look like on the screen, so I wanted you to have a hard copy. I found it fascinating this week. Sometimes when you're studying the Bible, geography actually makes a big difference in what you're learning about. And I didn't know this, but if you just take a look at where Jesus lived, it says something about his mission. So if you can see on your map, it's really hard because it's red and there's red behind it, but it says Capernaum there above Galilee, and that's where Jesus chose to headquarter his ministry. Now we're talking about the king who's coming to establish his kingdom, right? That's what the book of Mark is about, and he's going to have to suffer. But let me ask you this question. Why didn't he set up his ministry in Jerusalem? Down here. It's not on the map on the TV, but it's down here. He's way up north. What's he doing? Jerusalem's the religious center of the nation, right? It's the political powerhouse. It's where the temple's at. It's where the highest concentration of the Jewish people are at. Why is he up north? Well, I'm glad you asked. I would have expected the king to show up and take up residence in Jerusalem, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he goes to Capernaum in Galilee. The Bible doesn't leave us silent here to answer this question. If we look at Matthew 4:13-16, it says this about Jesus. And leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. So Jesus went to Galilee to fulfill a prophecy about his life and ministry. And notice what it called Galilee. Galilee of the Gentiles. Why did it call it that? Well, that area was given to the two tribes, Zebulun and Naphtali, the two tribes of Israel. But because of their unfaithfulness, God sent in other nations to exile them. And so as early as 800 BC, so 800 years before Christ shows up, there are Gentiles living in that land, which is where Galilee's at. Oh, the map is down. And they're calling it already, this is 800 years before Christ shows up, Galilee of the Gentiles. So what you have is a mix of people that live in Galilee. It's not strictly Jewish. Now, I didn't know that till this week. Jesus didn't grow up around only Jews. Now, Nazareth is just a little bit further south than Capernaum. I wish I had put that on the map. That's where he grew up. So he grew up around a mix of people, Jews and Gentiles. And then he chooses to have his ministry right in the middle of all that. And then if we just look around a little bit, you can see on the map, to the right you have the Decapolis. That's a largely Gentile area. Now there are some Jews that live there, we know that, but it's mainly Gentile. And then if you go up north, you have the Tetrarchy of Philip, which is another largely Gentile area. And if you go to the left, you have Phoenicia, which is where part of our story happens today, and that's the Gentile area. Tyre and Sidon are there. And then you go down to Samaria. And Samaria is interesting because you have the Samaritans that live there. And who are they? Well, they're the group of Jews that long before Jesus arrived had chosen to intermarry with other nations. And so the Jewish people largely rejected them and actually hated them and sought not to do anything with them. And it tells us that in the Bible. John 4:9, the Samaritan woman said to Jesus, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" And then in parentheses, John says, "For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Well, there you have it. An ethnic divide right south of where Christ lives, grew up, did his ministry. So you've got, Jesus is surrounded by Gentiles. He lives in an area of the country in Galilee that has Gentiles in it. And right below him is this hot pocket of ethnic controversy. That's the world he lived in. That's the world he ministered in. And it has a lot to say about what he was supposed to be doing here and his ministry and where it was aimed at and where our text is at today. So to answer the question, why would Jesus go there? Why would he go to Nazareth? I think we need to see this as Jesus fulfilling Israel's call as a nation to be a light to the Gentiles. You know, if you look back on Israel's history in the Old Testament, you see a lot of ups and downs, but mostly downs. And sadly, Israel never fulfilled their call to be a light to the Gentiles. In fact, God tells them that they led the nations astray. They're supposed to be a light, and yet they're leading the nations astray into further wickedness. And so God says it's enough, and he exiles them out. And while they're in exile, there's a lot of thinking that happens. I mean, you can imagine being sent to a foreign country. And they realize that they're in exile because they haven't kept God's covenant. They haven't followed God's laws. And so during that time, you have just kind of a renewed interest in following God's commandments and obeying him. And yet, sadly, what develops during that time is an extra religious layer that grows, and it gets the best of them. You see, in the book of Leviticus, God talks about ritual purity and his people being clean. And he does it in some really specific ways. But what happens is they begin to add to that list. And the teachers keep adding to that list. And they start to define what it means to be clean. And therefore acceptable with God. And able to have fellowship with God. And so the list keeps getting bigger. And pretty soon that list is put alongside Scripture. And they're held in the same authority. And so the people believe that what God said to Moses is the same as what God said to the rabbis throughout all these years. And we got to keep both. They're equal. And so what happens is this idea of ritual purity gets twisted into something it's not meant to be. And God's intention for it gets skewed. Ritual purity was meant to be maintained so that the people could fellowship with God. And fellowship with God was meant to attract the nations to Israel. When the nations saw the blessing of God on this country, they were supposed to come and say, "What's going on here? I want in." That's how God designed it. Ritual purity was never meant to be used to keep God's people from interacting with the nations around them. That's not what it was for. And yet that's what's happening, and that's what's happening in our text today. So let's look at the immediate context. I just need to do a little bit more review, and then we'll dive in. So 3 weeks ago, Mark took us to the first section of chapter 7. And if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there with me. In this chapter, we start out by learning that Jesus goes head-to-head with the Pharisees over the fact that he wasn't requiring his disciples to wash their hands before they ate. Now, as Pastor Mark worked through this passage, he didn't have time to dig out some of the details that he wished he could have. He just didn't have time for that. So we're going to go back and dig in a little bit more, and we're going to see how that relates to today's passage. So read with me, Mark 7:1, or just follow along with me. Now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. We'll stop there. Now it's interesting to note that the two words for wash in verse 3 and 4 are different. So in verse 3 it says they wash their hands. And that kind of washing would be just like what we do. We wash our hands before we eat. Except for them, it had ritual significance. But the second word for wash in verse 4 is the same word where we get our word for baptize. So you could translate this, when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they bathe. If you're wondering what's going on there, maybe this will help you. This is what one commentary said. After being in the marketplace and coming into contact with Gentiles, or even non-observant Jews, the Pharisees would wash themselves to ensure their ritual cleanness. So they get home, they've been in the marketplace, and they may have brushed up against a Gentile when they were there. Or they may have seen a Samaritan and touched shoulders or something. So to be clean, to stay clean, I've got to go home and I've got to take a ritual bath. And you might be asking, well, why are they worried about who they're around in the marketplace? What's up with that? Well, the Pharisees believed that contact with a Gentile or a Samaritan or a non-practicing Jew would render them ritually unclean. And why do they want to stay clean? Well, they believed that staying clean allowed them to stay in fellowship with God. And that was important. And you look at that and you think, well, that makes sense. And they want to be with God, right? They want to stay in fellowship with God. They want to follow his direction. But what happened is they had added so many requirements to this idea of ritual purity that they had reinterpreted the law to mean that they were to avoid contact with Gentiles and other groups. This was keeping them from fulfilling their mission that God had given them to be a light to the Gentiles. For the Pharisees to come in contact with a Gentile or a Samaritan or another even non-practicing Jew was to become unclean. And the only way to fix that was to take a bath before you eat. And this was such a common practice that it was standard for Jewish homes in this time frame to be built with a bath. And archaeologists are still uncovering these today. Yet we've got to understand that that requirement is nowhere to be found in the Mosaic Law. It's not there. It was their tradition that got added over the centuries and slowly became authoritative. So the Pharisees, in fact, were so obsessed with taking baths after being in the marketplace that they confronted Jesus about this in Luke 11:37. He didn't take a bath before he came in and ate at the Pharisees' house, and they're just like, whoa, you can't do that. So here they are confronting Jesus, who gave them the law on Mount Sinai, about what he's doing. So the Pharisees had added to their own rules, or added to these rules about purity, their own category, to the extent that they could avoid loving certain people. In a misguided attempt to be acceptable with God, the Pharisees eliminated all contact with outsiders, such as Samaritans or Gentiles. So let's see how this impacts our passage today. Go with me to Mark 7, verse 24, and we're going to go ahead and read the whole passage together. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. Yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, when you read these two miracles back to back, just out of context in the Bible, just grab them and read them, you're probably struck with just how incredible they are. And you might be thinking, well, Mark is trying to show off Jesus' incredible power. And I think you're right. I think he is. I mean, think about this for just a minute. Jesus is talking to this woman, and she wants him to heal, wants him to cast this demon out. And so he goes back and forth, and then he just says this to her. Go back home, your demon's gone. Now, did he take the time to actually say, demon, leave? He didn't. I mean, he thought it. I mean, he's God. This is incredible. You know, all throughout the scriptures, we see God speaking and it happens. Well, here he doesn't say a word and the demon's gone. That's incredible. And the next miracle is no less incredible. I mean, you have an ear that's not working right. You guys know how intricate ears are. And somehow Jesus can touch this ear, and whatever's going wrong in that tiny eardrum or whatever it is fixed. We should be blown away by that. And the people in this story are blown away by that. They're amazed. And yet the question we need to ask is, why is Mark telling us this story here? Why is he putting this story in this spot in the gospel? You know, Mark's not just creating a biography and putting all these facts together that aren't related. Mark has a message. Mark's trying to say something to us, and God's trying to say something to us through that. So we've got to get there. We've got to answer the question, why is Mark putting this here? What's he trying to say? And I think the answer is directly related to the context. Now, Mark has just gotten through telling us about hand washing, right? Unclean hands. And then he goes on and talks about unclean hearts. This was the sermon 2 weeks ago. Sin doesn't come from the outside. Sin comes from the inside, out of our hearts and our desires. So what's he doing here? Mark's talking about unclean people. And he's trying to make a point. One commentary said it well. Why does Mark place this incident here? It follows naturally the preceding incidents. Jews normally had no relationship with Gentiles because associations with them made Jews ritually unclean. Jesus now shows, by example, that those oral laws are invalid, and deliberately associates himself with a Gentile woman. And the question this text is forcing upon us is this: does Jesus think that any person is so unclean that he can't be with them, touch them, or help them? Is he limiting his interaction with a certain group of people on the earth? Is he excluding anyone from entrance into his kingdom? Remember, the king is here. He's bringing his kingdom. Or is he purposefully going after those who would not normally be considered part of his kingdom? Well, I think you know where I'm going with this. Let's look together at the first miracle. So verse 24. In this miracle, I think Mark is answering this question. Can Gentiles receive the same messianic blessings as the Jews? I mean, this Messiah has been prophesied for hundreds of years, and he's coming to the Jews. Do the Gentiles get to slip in there and get some of that too? Let's see how Mark sets up the story. Verse 24. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So if you look at your map, you can see where Tyre and Sidon are. This is Phoenicia. This is Gentile country. So Jesus is intentionally entering Gentile territory. It appears that he's looking for some rest. He doesn't get that. Instead, people hear he's there, and suddenly, there's this lady there who's asking for help. And notice that her daughter is what? Her daughter's unclean. She has an unclean spirit. Now, just for clarity, spirit here is just a reference to a demon. If you follow the rest of the chapter, or the next verses, the spirit is called a demon. So we're talking about a fallen angel who has indwelt someone and is in control, and we presume wreaking havoc. And this woman is asking Jesus to do something about this. And we need to feel the weight of what's at stake here in Jesus' interaction with her. We're told that she's a Syrophoenician. So she's from this area. She's a Gentile. One commentary said this: she's a Gentile, she's a woman, and her daughter is possessed by a defiling spirit. All of which factors would render her off limits for close contact with a Jewish rabbi such as Jesus. In other words, if Jesus just does what everyone does in his culture at this time, he would have nothing to do with her. He would send her away. He would have no interactions with her. But he does. Now we need to say a little bit about Jesus' response to the woman, because when you first read this, it looks like it's derogatory. He seems to be putting her in a category of dogs. And we read that and we think, wow, that's awful. Well, we need some cultural help here. First of all, it was common at that time for the Jews to think of themselves as God's favored people and for them to look down on the nations around them. In fact, according to one scholar, the list of derogatory comments about other nations is nearly endless in Jewish literature of the time. So, him referring to Gentiles as dogs is not something that she would be unfamiliar with. This is common language for how the Jews talked about the nations around them. Endless derogatory comments. So this is nothing new. And the question that we should be asking here is, did Jesus agree with that? Did Jesus agree with that attitude that the Jews had? Or is he going to dismantle that? Did Jesus agree with the idea that God only wanted a relationship with the Jews and had no plan for the rest of the nations? You know, I've already argued at the beginning of the book that this gospel is showing us that that's not true. So what is Jesus doing here? One commentary was particularly helpful for me. It said this: Jesus is being intentionally provocative in order to elicit the correct response from the woman. He's testing her to see whether she will claim what is rightfully hers, namely the opportunity to receive God's blessings in the new age of salvation. So this would be like a father who tells his children that at 3 o'clock, we're all going to go and get ice cream. And then 3 o'clock comes around, and the kids come and say, Dad, it's time to go. Let's go get ice cream. The dad could say, okay, let's go get in the car. Let's go. Or he could try to draw something out of his kids, and he'd say, no, we're not going to get ice cream. Just hoping that their response immediately would be, but you said, you promised, we're going to get ice cream. And then he might say, of course, I did promise that. And I keep my promises, and I love you, so let's go get ice cream. That's what Jesus is doing here. See, God has already made promises in the Old Testament about him coming and delivering the goods, not just to Israel, but to the Gentiles. So what this woman is doing in her response is actually holding Jesus' feet to the fire. But you promised. Promised. And Jesus is like, you're right. Demon's gone. He wanted her to respond rightly. He's not insulting her. He's not arguing with her. He just wanted to bring out the right answer. And in doing that, he's confronting this notion that's prevalent in his day that we're the Jews and we're God's chosen people and we get all the blessings, and the Gentiles, you're scum, you're dogs, you're worthless. He just smashes that to pieces. Instead, he boldly demonstrates, as one author wrote, that in the kingdom age, in the kingdom that Jesus Christ comes to bring, the messianic blessings of salvation will be for all who respond in faith, regardless of ethnic identity. So how is Mark answering this question? With this miracle, this question that he asks is, can the messianic blessings belong to the Gentiles too? And the answer is yes, they do. Now, we might not feel the weight of controversy this would stir up in our day and age. We live in America and we have a lot of different ethnicities here. And we still have a lot of issues in those areas. But for Christ to show up and to say, this is not just for you guys. This is for everyone. This was so countercultural. This is kind of like the odd child doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the kids in his classroom. He doesn't dress the same. Maybe he doesn't speak the same. Maybe he has an accent. Maybe he doesn't speak English. Recess comes and he kind of plays off by himself in the corner. Just keeps to himself. It would be very odd for one of the students in the classroom to reach out to this student and try to build a relationship with this guy who's just kind of the odd one of the bunch. That's exactly what Jesus is doing. In a day and age where the Jews would write off Gentiles or Samaritans, Jesus is going right after them. He's willing to break all the rules to go after these people. And we'll come back to this later, but what about us? What about us? Are we willing to break all the rules of cultural Christianity? To go after unbelievers around us? Or is this just about us? We're good. Jesus came. Saved me, my family. That's who I'm hanging with. I've got to ask these questions. Let's look at the second miracle. Verse 31. Here Mark again is repeating the same question. Can these blessings come to the Gentiles? But then he's asking a different question. Is it okay for a ritually clean rabbi, namely Jesus, to touch a ritually defiled Gentile? Can he do that? Is this allowed? Look with me at verse 31. Then he, namely Jesus, returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the Decapolis. So here we are in Gentile territory again. Jesus intentionally travels through Gentile territory, Sidon, down to the Decapolis, which is a Gentile area again. And what do the people ask Jesus to do? They brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to do what? To speak to him so he could be healed? To lay his hand on him. What's Jesus going to do? He's a rabbi. Rabbis don't do that. This man's a Gentile. This is such a no-no. This is like my 18-month-old who's right now infatuated with our trash can. So I found him digging out trash the other day in the kitchen. I'm like, oh, this is disgusting. Get out of there. Of course, he doesn't understand that, but this is a no-no if you're a Pharisee. You don't touch Gentiles. If you do, go home and bathe. So don't do it. Stay away. Let's try to clarify a few things from the text. Question 1. Is this man able to speak at all? My translation said speech impediment here. The Greek word is not clear. It could be speech impediment. It could be that he just couldn't speak at all. Later on it says that when Jesus healed him, he could speak plainly. So that makes us think that probably he could say some few words, but it wasn't very clear at all. And when Jesus healed him, he could speak plainly. It's really not that important for what's going on here, but it's a question people have. But secondly, what's all this about spitting and touching the ears and all that? We don't get that. Well, there's some cultural stuff happening here that we just miss. So in the ancient world, spitting and saliva are actually associated with healing. I know, it's weird. We don't get that. We think of healing like touching your hand on someone, praying for them, but there's actually stories in the ancient world where saliva was used to heal people. Okay, so this isn't weird to them. They would read that and be like, oh, that's cool, okay, keep going. So this isn't some weird thing that Jesus is doing. But I think what we really need to see here is that Jesus is taking the liberty to break the customs of the Jews by touching an unclean Gentile, even coming in contact with his body fluids. He touched his tongue. Gross. I mean, I would think that's gross for me, but just the way the Pharisees thought and the religious leaders, you don't come in contact with bodily fluids. Jesus is willing to communicate his concern and his compassion by touching the very areas of need in this man's life. Jesus is not staying away. And he doesn't stay away from you. And your problems either. He doesn't think they're too dirty. Just gets right in the middle of it. If you let him. There's more happening here, though. This word for dumb or speech impediment is not used anywhere else in the Bible, except in the Greek Old Testament in Isaiah 35:6. There, the ESV translates it as mute, and it says this: "Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy." This passage in Isaiah is describing the Messianic age. By using this word, Mark is alerting his readers that the sign of the Messianic age, namely the mute being able to sing, has come. The Messiah is here. But notice, which mute person's singing? It's a Gentile. It's not an Israelite. The Messianic age has brought blessings, not just on the Jews, but also the Gentiles. So just to conclude here with this miracle, Mark's question again: do the Gentiles get the same blessings? Mark says yes. Question 2, can Jesus touch an unclean man? Mark's answer is yes. Jesus' inward cleanliness, his right standing with God, is not affected by him touching someone who's outside of God's covenant with Israel and who has a physical problem. Jesus is free to embrace all people, regardless of their ethnicity or their physical state. That is why we do missions. Because every nation needs to hear this news. Every ethnicity, every people group needs to hear about Christ. It's not for us only. And nobody is too gross for Jesus. My kids are going to laugh at this. We were welcomed by some neighbors the other day with a really nice gift basket. I was shocked. Had wine, it had some sparkling grape juice, other things, and there was a bunch of toys for the kids in there. I was overwhelmed. I mean, I'd expect someone to bring cookies or something like that, but they put a lot of effort into this. But before she left, she said, "Oh, by the way, sorry about the slime." And I thought, slime? Oh boy, it's going to be interesting. Well, the next thing I knew, the kids were in the backyard, and they opened up the slime bucket. And my wife is like, "You need to go back there and give them some directions." So I go back there, and I'm looking at this bucket of slime, and I kind of read the label, and it says, it's kind of supposed to wash out, but they're not really guaranteeing it'll wash out. And so I told my kids, you guys can play with this, but you got to know, I mean, if you care about the clothes you're wearing, you might want to change before you get into this. And we might be having to pick all this up off the grass. And then I left. Well, I heard a lot of, shouting and everything going on in the backyard. And about 10 minutes later, there were several kids that were in tears, and there was just mayhem. And several of them had slime on their shirts and stuff like that. It was just nasty. And they're trying to wash it off, and it doesn't really come off that well. And Randy and I are like, "Stay out of the house!" And so we ended up going back in the backyard, and I said, "Okay, guys, we got to pick this stuff up." I'm looking at these like globs of slime all over my backyard, thinking, what's it going to do? Take like 4 months to decompose? And you're walking along, and slide around in that stuff. It was gross. So we picked it all up and put it in the trash can, and it took like an hour to clean up. And the next day I had to go out and wash off my deck because some of it got on there. Anyway, point being, sin is like that. It's nasty. It's gross. It's disgusting. It's sticky. It clings to you. But does Jesus still get involved? Does Jesus still touch you? He didn't just touch us. He let the sin touch him. Didn't he? Isn't that what happened on the cross? The sin that we had committed was placed on him. And he had to wear our slime. Uncovered before the world, naked, shame, rejected by the Father. Why? Why would he do that? Why would he do that? Why would Jesus become unclean for us? Ephesians 5:25-27. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that he might be holy, that she might be holy and without blemish. Why did Jesus die? Because his bride was dirty. She was covered in slime. She was repulsive. And he had to take that on. Why? So he could have a gorgeous bride. Do you guys know? If you're in this room and you're a believer, do you know your destiny? You're part of a bride. Did you get this? Without spot or wrinkle or any such thing. Do you know your destiny is to be part of that bride? You will shine. You will shine with the bride of Christ. You're part of that bride of Christ. One day, and his pleasure in you can only be captured on a wedding day. And that's the best we can do now. I remember when my bride came down the aisle. I'll never forget it. It's coming. We're going to be the bride of Christ. But we still get dirty, don't we? I sin every day. What do? We know we're clean. We know we're clean in Christ. We know that we will be clean forever when we get glorified. But what about now? 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. He's still cleaning us up. Little by little. It's not done yet. So how do we respond to such an amazing story? Such an amazing reality, such an amazing Savior who would come and become unclean? First of all, notice that Jesus doesn't call anybody unclean. He doesn't put boundaries around his ministry. In fact, he put himself in the middle of it all. So in the back of your card here, I had Donna help me here, my neighborhood. And what I mean by neighborhood is just the people that you interact with on a regular basis. People you see at work, people you see at school, people you see in your physical neighborhood, maybe your family, extended family. And what I'm just asking you to do is to think about who is that? Who's in my neighborhood? And is there anybody on that list that I would call unclean? Is there anybody on that list that I am not willing to engage in a relationship with? Am I distancing myself from them on purpose? Am I repulsed by their sin? Too much slime? No, I got to meet one of my neighbors this last week. And she and her boyfriend or husband, I'm not sure if they're married, got to talk to them both, and they have a little boy. And just getting to know her a little bit. I don't know how you guys, what happens inside of you when you talk to someone who you suspect is an unbeliever just by the way they're talking about life and their values and things like that. I don't know what happens in your heart, but I know what happens in my heart. Sometimes, actually, oftentimes. It's not pretty. So she's kind of just talking away, and she's quite a talker. And she'd been smoking a cigarette and not afraid to throw in a curse word here and there. And find out that they got together a couple years ago, and a couple months into the relationship, found out she was pregnant. So I don't know about you, but in my heart, I'm making assumptions about this person. Making a list. Oh, maybe not married. Oh. Do you do that? I do that. Am I going to call her unclean? Or am I going to build a relationship with them and get to know them? Find out what their story is. Find out why they do what they do. Find out what's driving that. Build a relationship with the hopes that one day I can share the gospel with them. That's what I need to do. That's my response to this message. She's not unclean. Not unclean enough for Jesus. She better not be too unclean for me. I think in the church today, there's some specific groups that we are tempted with as a church, in our church culture, to call unclean and to distance ourselves from. And I just want to mention them. And you guys can think about that. Pray about this. We're tempted to call unclean and distance ourselves from those who have same-sex attraction. So the LGBTQ community. In church culture today, too often, our attitudes and our actions are saying, whoa. I'm guilty. I'm guilty of that. We still have time to change. We can see Jesus. Say, Jesus, change me. I don't want to be like that. These people aren't unclean to you. What about the folks who've been divorced? You know, I sat across from a guy at Starbucks a couple months ago who, through tears, explained to me how at church he felt like he had a scarlet letter on his chest because he'd been divorced. I know this guy. I know his character. His wife left him for someone else, had affairs. He tried to reconcile, to no avail, and ended it in a divorce. And yet, at church, people treated him differently because he got a divorce. At church. He works as a chaplain. And there's a group of chaplains that he works with of all different religions. Can you imagine that? He's the Christian, the one with the solid biblical stance on everything. These folks are all over the board on these issues that we hold dearly to. He feels more welcome there than he does at church. They don't judge him for his divorce. Do you look at someone differently because they got a divorce? Are you tempted to do that? I am. Do you view them with suspicion? Oh, divorce. Okay. That's what goes on in my heart, time to time. God help me. God help us. Who else do we call unclean? What about different ethnicities? Those who speak a different language. They don't act like we do. They don't speak like we do. They have radically different assumptions about the world than we do, or about time management or leadership or whatever. What about the homeless? They don't fit into our societal norms. Are they too clean? Are they unclean? So that's my question is, who's in your neighborhood? Who's in your life? Is anybody too unclean for you to touch them? In closing here, I just want to mention that Jesus intentionally mixes his life with unbelievers. Let's not get so busy in our Christian life and all the Christian activities that we do that we don't have time to make relationships with unbelievers. And I'd be the first one to say that I'm guilty of that. But God's at work. God's at work in my heart. I trust he's at work in your heart. And the last thing I want to say is that when we do build relationships with people, hopefully some unbelievers, let's be ready to tell them about Jesus. Let's be ready to show them Jesus by the way that we're welcoming them into our lives. And just where the Lord's had me the last couple years in ministry at the church I came from, we talked a lot about helping people grow and learning to reach out to people. And one thing that I heard a lot is just people feel uncomfortable sharing the gospel. Feel like they're not good at it. Feel like they need some help. If that's you, man, you're normal. I feel your pain. Well, I want to let you know about something that's coming up. There's a book that's been written called Gospel Fluency, written by a pastor here in the Seattle area. And he's having a one-day conference in October where you can just grow in this ability to connect the gospel into everyday conversations and learn how to use that in the way you talk to believers and unbelievers. So the elders would like to invite you guys to come with us in October 26th, to this one-day training in Seattle. And if you want to buy the book ahead of time, it's called Gospel Fluency. I meant to bring it up here. I don't know where it went. You can do that. It's an easy read. But I want to invite you to think about that. Maybe the Lord's stirring in your heart. Hey, as I think about reaching out to others, I need to get equipped and think about how can I share the gospel in natural ways. So come with us, October 26th. It'll be fun. Let's pray.